Hello. Welcome to the New York Public Library. Please silence your cell phones. My name is Salvatore Scabona, Weinberg, Director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers here at the library. As many of you know, the Cullman Center selects 15 fellows a year for a 9-month term. Fellows receive an office in the center, access to the library's collections, and a stipend so they can focus exclusively on their work during their fellowships. The fellows are some of the best and most promising academics, independent scholars, poets, playwrights, journalists, dramatists, artists, and fiction writers at work today. They come here from around the country and the world to use the unparalleled collections housed at this library to write the books of tomorrow. The Cullman Center was founded in 1999, and we're currently hosting our 26th annual class of fellows. This series of conversations presents the books that they came here to write. Tonight, we're very proud and privileged to present The New Internationals, the new novel by David Wright Faladé, a portrait and a love story drawn in part from life, in part from research, and in part from imagination of Paris after World War II, when the end of Nazi occupation, the aftermath of the Holocaust, and the rise of the anti-colonial movement and the international communist youth movement created a world in upheaval where the rules of the past no longer applied. David was the Mary Ellen von der Heyden Fellow at the Cullman Center during the 2021-2022 fellowship year. He'll discuss the book with the novelist Julie Orringer. After about 35 to 40 minutes, they'll move on to your questions. If you'd like to pose a question, please write it on the index card on your seat. A staff member will pass along the outside aisles to collect your questions in about a half an hour. This event is being live streamed on YouTube. If you're joining us virtually, please share your questions either in the chat or by emailing cullmancenter@nypl.org. Copies of The New Internationals are for sale in the hall, and David has agreed to sign yours after this presentation. Our presenters, Julie Orringer is the author of 3 award-winning books, How to Breathe Underwater, The Invisible Bridge, and The Flight Portfolio, which was the basis for the 2023 Netflix series Transatlantic. She's the winner of the Paris Review's Plimpton Prize and has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the NEA, the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, McDowell, and, of course, the Cullman Center, where she was the Ronig Jaffe Foundation Fellow in 2008-2009. She teaches at New York University and Stanford. David Wright Faladé is professor of English at the University of Illinois. He's the author of the novel Black Cloud Rising and co-author of the young adult novel Away Running and the narrative history Fire on the Beach, recovering the lost story of Richard Etheridge and the Pea Island Lifesavers, which was a New Yorker notable selection and a St. Louis Dispatch Best Book of 2001. He's a recipient of a Zora Neale Hurst Richard Wright Award and has written for The New Yorker, The Village Voice, Southern Review, Newsday, and many others. Please help me welcome Julie Orringer and David Wright Faladé.
Well, hello. Hello to all of you, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My students in the audience, I'm so pleased to have you here. And it's exciting to get to see David's friends and just to be here to talk about this exciting new novel. So thank you so much for coming to talk to us about your book.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for agreeing to talk to me.
Well, it was such a pleasure to read, and I'm so excited to hear you tell everybody here about it. So this novel takes place primarily in the period immediately following the war in France. And we get a little bit of the war just at the very beginning of the book. But I'm first interested in hearing you talk about how this period of time and that particular place captured your imagination and gave rise to this novel. And perhaps by way of answering this question, you can give us a little précis of the novel so we can all get on the same page, as it were.
Yeah, so it's set in Paris in 1947, and at the heart of it is a love triangle between a Holocaust survivor and an African from the French colonies, West African colonies, and a black GI. And I pulled the heart of the story is sort of the story of my parents. Different time frame slightly. Well, a lot maybe, but still fundamentally that after-war period. And so growing up with that history, even if for a long time I didn't quite fully know it, it was always kind of present, you know. We'd hear, my big sister's right there. We'd hear stories about our mom, or she would tell us things. We just had this sense of this sort of big dramatic story. And then as I got to be an adult and I got to know more of it, there was this interesting story. And so for me, it was clear it was all something I wanted to try to write about. It was unclear how I might be able to pull it off. So.
Well, I'm really curious to know how the snippets of that story started to reveal themselves to you, or how you started to become aware of the presence of this story in your family and in your personal history.
So, I mean, my mom was born in 1931 and I was born in 1964, and in France. The man who I thought was my father was a black GI. And I was born in France in 1964. So that was sort of Miriam and my first experience was that. But we come to the United States in 1966. So like the year before Loving v. Virginia. And our mother was like 5'0" nothing, you know? And so this...
Mine too, actually.
You know, this little woman with biracial children, at that point, you know, biracial means black still today, but especially then, you know, there was always a certain otherness that we were aware of as kids. Even within our family, the Wrights in Kansas City, very poor Kansas City, Kansas is where we lived. And then we moved to Junction City, Kansas. So there was always a sense of otherness, even from the black community to a certain extent, a lot because of our French-Jewish mother. So it was just part of the fabric of who we were. And I think the stories just sort of trickled down. But Mom had this weird, she might say something. She wasn't the sort of person who would like be deliberately evasive, but there was a weird sort of fog. So she might say something. We'd have a sense of this story or that story, but it was never super clear. We were both really close with her mother, our grandmother, and she was the opposite. She like knew these stories and she would tell these stories. And so as I moved to France after college, as an adult, they just started to fall into place, but very much from my mother's perspective, because a lot of it was just me and my grandmother speaking. And then it sort of, again, the story does that. And as I got to know other members of my family, my African family and all that, it was just a time, and these were people who were just in the middle of everything, despite themselves to a certain extent, but you're there and you do what you do. And so I mentioned this a second ago, that the challenge was to try to shape a story out of that.
Yeah, well, that's the next question I have for you. I mean, I'm dying to know, yes.
Could you point the mic a little bit
More at me? Yeah.
the speaker, you get some feedback.
Sorry.
I'm dying to know how you went from an awareness of this familial history, a complicated history, to your own life as a writer, and then the further extension of knowing that this was something that you wanted to explore as a novel.
Yeah. I think it's these stories that brought me to trying to be a writer. I went to a small liberal arts college in Minnesota, great school. It was a great experience. My college roommate is right next to my sister. And, you know, we're young from, you know, we played football. We're sort of a little marginal in various ways, race, but also sort of these dunderhead football players in this sort of super intellectual place. And getting interested, I mean, very curious, getting interested in things. So the story was always there as something that I thought I might want to try to put on the page. But I don't know that I was able to think of myself as a writer. I wasn't then, and I'm not even now a particularly good reader. I reread a lot more than I actually read in a weird way. And so when I finished college and I went abroad, and I'm getting to be very close with my grandmother, and I was getting to know my biological family at the time, again, it was just a ready-made story to be told. So I'm beginning to imagine myself as a writer, and that's clearly a story for me to tell. When I think of myself as a writer, it's the stories that I think I can tell and maybe I need to tell that make me think of myself in that way. If it weren't for those stories, I don't think I'd be a writer. So in that way, the story was important to me. But again, it was just the pieces were so dramatic. And I was fortunate enough to have enough of the people be alive and to be really present in my life, and many of them were in Paris. So I'm not sure I answered your question. I feel like I answered around it.
You did. You answered it in some of the ways that are, I think, most interesting to me. Just like, how do we become personally invested, not just in the understanding of a tale, but also in the telling of a tale? And you mentioned something that I think is really important, which is being able to speak to people directly about their experiences about which you've already become curious. So when you lived in Paris, did you have a sense that you were actively interviewing people for a book that you were going to try to write? Or
no.
Was that just you became interested in them and then you found yourself exploring their stories more deeply?
My grandmother, we called her Manu. I have no idea why. Her name was Jeanne. But everybody called her Manu. And she was older. She was born in 1907, and I get to Paris in the 80s. So she's much older, and she lived in, this 6th-floor walk-up but no elevator. And so on Fridays, that was one of the days we did not have practice. And so I'd meet her, and we'd go, she lived in Montmartre. We'd do errands in the neighborhood, and then I'd carry her heavy groceries up to her apartment. But then she'd make me lunch, and we'd talk. But she had been a graphologist. Elodie in the novel, there's a character based on her in the novel. Elodie, the character based on her, and Zancy, the character based on my African aunt, are the ones I think who are closest to the people I think I knew. With Manu, the Elodie character, she was born into a Jewish family with a stepmother that she had a really difficult relationship with, and was married off at a relatively young age into a very wealthy family, but she had no relationship with her husband. And so she, her mother-in-law called her the Queen Bungler in public, in front of people. And they were very wealthy. Her father-in-law was the president of the Antiquarian Society of Europe. So there's this tremendous wealth in the 30s, very secular Jews. So no sort of relationship to the religion. That's when my mother was born. Manu, I'm saying all that as a way to say, Manu in the mid-50s, after surviving the war and all that stuff, just was like, I've had enough, and she divorced at 50, had never had a job in her life outside of the home, had no professional training, but what she was drawn to was, like Elodie in the book, was handwriting. And so she learned and trained to be a graphologist, which mattered. It was a sort of profession that mattered more in France than it ever did here. And so when I'm, fast forward another 30 years, when I'm having lunch with Manu pretty much every Friday, she would tell me these stories, and every now and then she would go back into her room and come out with a letter and then, describe all this stuff. And it's super fascinating. It's myself, I'm not sure I believe it. Is this true or is not? But then, she'd read I'd show her the letter of a friend of mine that a friend had sent me in English that she wasn't very fluent in English, and she would describe that person to a T, just looking at the letter. And so at a certain point, she started showing me my mother's letters. And then a little bit later one day, she said to me, do you want them? And she gave me all the letters that she had exchanged with my mother. Some are dated to like when my mom was a child, like the 40s. So I suddenly had an archive. And at that point, it starts feeling more real. It's not just sort of these interesting stories that matter to me and that I think I certainly want to write, but I maybe need to write. At that point, it's real in a way. And at that point, I think I get to the place you're describing.
Okay, well, that's so interesting, too, because when you're proceeding from a real life, one that you have not only your own sort of personal experience of through, being your mother's son and growing up within your family, but also these documents, the letters that capture your mother's experience from the time when she was just a little girl, decades before you were around.
Yeah.
How do you then move from that rich repository of emotional and historical material to the creation of a character?
That was the huge problem. And so this book has been in the works since 2004, probably. It started as a short story, but I knew it was going to grow from there. And Cecile, the character based on my mother, was always the center. And I worked on it, hard, like we all work on stuff hard, and I thought I knew what I was doing. And in 2016, I finished a draft of this big novel that was about 500 pages long, the precursor of this. It was big. But I thought it was doing all the things I wanted it to do, and my agent at the time circulated it, and the 14 or 15 houses all rejected it, and they all pointed to the Cecile character. And so, I mean, not only do I know that's the thing I still need to figure out, the person I still need to figure out, but it also sort of, it made me, we were talking craft a little bit earlier, it also made me, I mean, I always think about craft, but it made me re-understand my relationship to myself as, technically, as a writer. I went through this sort of, one can imagine, this 500-page monstrosity that gets rejected by everybody. And I hadn't really, I'd published some short stuff, but I hadn't published a book since Fire on the Beach in 2001. And so I went through that sort of couple of year funk where I was pestering all my friends like, am I a failed writer? Am I a failed writer? But when I got past that and I worked my way back around to it is when I wrote Black Cloud Rising. And the thing that Black Cloud Rising, I'm saying all that to say this, the thing that Black Cloud Rising taught me was that the books I like to read drive forward, and they're focused in a sort of way. And it doesn't have to be a huge incident, but the characters, I always think of Toni Morrison. When I was living in Paris, and I'm beginning to imagine myself a writer in the 80s, there's no Google and all that, so I would go to the American Library in Paris, and I'd read these interviews with writers, and I remember Toni Morrison in more than one interview talking about telling a simple story about complicated characters. And so in my mind, I'm like, I've got to complicate the characters and keep focused and drive forward. And that's what I tried to do with Black Cloud Rising. And then by the time I applied to the Cullman, I was thinking I was going to get rid of Cecile as a point of view character and have it just the two men, a love triangle, but the two men focused on her because I felt like I understood them. And then Julia Folks and Maddie Tien and some folks were like, you can't do that. You're an idiot. And so I tried to figure her out, but I understood that it had to be that sort of Black Cloud Rising model. So that thing that was 500 pages becomes 300 pages. And that bigger thing much of it was in the sort of immediate post-war, but then it spans to 60, and a big part of it was in the States. And I just cut what I could cut and layered things in and made them work in this sort of, 6, 7, 8 month time frame so that everything feels immediate, it's present. All those things that were in the novel but were a little bit diffuse because they take place maybe over too long were suddenly central, so.
Yeah, well, it's really wonderful to hear you talk about the sort of focusing process that goes into the revision of a book because, one of the things I think is so challenging, I was talking to my thesis student about this earlier today, is that the act of writing a first draft just feels like everything. And you get through that and you're just like, okay, I'm done, but then you're really just embarking.
Yeah.
And so your relationship with Cecile evolved in innumerable ways, it sounds like, over the course of revision of the book. What about the presence of the men in the book? How did they evolve as characters, and what changed over the course of your writing the drafts of the book?
In this weird way, and this maybe says something about me as, a man in the world, they were complicated, but they didn't need as much of that sort of transformation. It wasn't that I completely knew them, but that original version of them, they had a certain complexity and immediacy. They weren't necessarily working on the page, but they didn't undergo as much transformation. It was really Cecile. And a lot of the way that I think about, I'm going to mispronounce the word, but chiaroscuro, that sort of play of black against white. I think of that in my own writing in that, the blacks are going to come off the page in contradistinction to the white. Mm-hmm. And I think of my characters in that way. So the two men, in a way, played off each other, but Cecile wasn't part of that conversation, of that song. And so when I could figure out the characters against which to bring her off the page in that way is when she started working. So therefore, Minette, LOD in a more immediate way. You know what I mean?
And what about Zancy? I wonder if you can speak a little bit about Seb's older sister and the role that she plays in the book.
So she does that for Seb, and from the beginning. But like I was mentioning, when I first met, so the other piece of my story that some of y'all know and others don't is that I found out when I was 16 that my father wasn't Wright, the man who I thought was my father, but was this African man. And then I met him, and complicated story, but they're from this really prominent family. And the aunt, he and I, when we first met, it's tough. This child appears in your life suddenly out of nowhere. And for me, it was equally tough and at a point in my life. So there was a distance between us. But before moving to Paris, I lived in London. And I had an occasion to go to Africa to meet the rest of the family. Again, don't want to get into the weeds of my personal story too much, but it was the character that Zancy is based on, who was my entree into the family. And she was this, my aunt, Solange. My mom growing up, we knew of her because my mom would talk about the family. I just didn't know that they were my family. She always said Solange hated her, and Solange didn't. But Solange was just like Zancy in the books, and she was brilliant. Solange Faladé,
was she a physician?
She became a physician. She and my father were sent to France, like I described in the book. She was 9, he was 7. They went with an older sister who I cut out of the story. But when the war broke out, they went in 35. When the war broke out, the older sister was like, I'm out, and went back to West Africa. And so Solange is in charge. And at that point, she was born in 25. At that point, she's like 15.
Wow.
She had, from a very early age, they were in a religious school, a convent. She was in a convent school. And a biracial Senegalese nun just recognized her brilliance. And so, sort of fostered her along. She gets her baccalaureate, the French more or less equivalent of a high school degree. It's a little bit harder. It involves some tests. She got that at 16 during the war. And then she gets admitted to medical school. The first woman, black West African, is admitted to École de Médecine. And she ends up training under, I was confused. It's Robert, I think, was the father. But Robert Debré, who's this pioneering pediatrician, or maybe Robert was his son, the politician. Regardless, this pioneering pediatrician goes to Senegal. This is in the 40s, so she's in her late 20s, and does this study on the effect of women carrying their children on their back. And it has this big impact. And she's in position to be in to sort of an administrative position at the hospital there, but because of gender and race, it goes to a white Frenchman. And she's a little, angry, outraged, revoltée. And so she turns towards psychoanalysis, and she ends up becoming the protege of Jacques Lacan.
Wow.
Right. And so dunderhead football player me arrives in 1987, and, she taught me how to hold a fork. I showed up the first time I went to her house, I was wearing my Carlton rugby jersey. Yeah. I needed a lot of work. But this is the person who, I'm imagining her playing a similar role like that with her younger brother.
Okay, yeah.
Right? And so I tried to shape the character based on her in the book in that way. There's just this really strong presence, really brilliant, really focused, complicated. She's got her weaknesses, but nobody sees them. Right?
Oh, she does. It seems like Seb can sort of see around the corners of her a little bit. Like there's certain times when there's this just incredible intimacy between the two of them that suggests the force that she's had to muster in order to continue to project this powerful presence who guides him in this guideless world.
Miriam and I are really close in at least, I don't want to say in similar ways to Max and Solange, although maybe, but certainly to how I imagined him in the book. So, he's, Max Faladé, and he's the, not just the eldest son of the descendants of the king of Dahomey, of the son of the last king of Dahomey, but he's the only son. And so he has a certain weight, just a place in that society and in that family as a male. But Solange she was the boss. But I always could say they were like this. They had been together, since they were, I'm trying to do the math, 7 and 9. So they were super close. But there was also this interesting he was deferential to her, but he also would do these things where he was trying to claim his place at certain times. And as I was imagining them at that younger age, and he had a harder time during the war. They both had hard times, but he had a harder time in the war in that they couldn't find a place to put him. He couldn't stay in the convent. He ends up in the south of France and in Orringer. He never finished his baccalaureate. He ends up being the first West African architect, French West African.
By way of working as a carpenter.
So he had this drive, but always a little bit, I think he always felt a little bit in her shadow.
Yeah.
And that's not the part that I tried to pull from me and Miriam, but I guess as a way to, I was thinking about this earlier. I was talking to John Mark. I was thinking about this earlier. There's this picture of us. A lot of our pictures we lost from our youth because it was peripatetic youth. We were a little bit all over. But there's this picture that an African aunt of mine had that I saw later. And I think Miriam must have been 3 and I was like 2. We were still in France. And Miriam is in, Are you about to throw something at me? I'm getting daggers. She's in these like capri pants, and she's got this little top on. She's got a little afro, and she just looks like a little adult. And then there's me, and like my belly sticking out of the white T-shirt. And you know, like the like kids back then when you had those paper, those cloth diapers, there were those kind of poofy plastic diapers, and I'm just sitting there like looking at her with admiration, and she's just this little adult. I felt like it was a little like that, like so, you know. It's a great picture, and kind of I would never show you, but it's this great picture that sort of represents what there's this thing there, this profound thing, but that child who's only slightly older understands the role that they have to play in this family.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's that I was trying to capture.
I love knowing that picture exists.
That you will never see.
Well, one of the things that I feel is kind of like at the emotional heart of the book is just the way Seb communicates his history, his personal history and his family history to Cecile, and the shortfall of total understanding, at least at first, on both sides.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can tell us how that storytelling came to lie at the center of the book the way it does, and why it was important to have him relate the history of Dahomey to her, and how you saw her evolving understanding of that story moving the book forward.
Yeah. Some of it goes back to that, sort of having the characters play off each other. And they both have this history that they're trying to make sense of. One of the things that seemed clear to me about the three central characters in the book is that they have this dramatic history that is close to them, but they don't quite understand. Seb has been in France since he's 7. He knows he's the son of the king of Dahomey, but what does that mean? He can't speak Yoruba or Fon anymore. He's been around French people much more than he's been around Africans. Paris in the 1930s, there's not a huge African community. He's got some family, but it's mostly Zancy. With Cecile, the character based on Cecile, I think she understands herself as a Jew mostly because of the war, because the family is just secular. They're Jewish and there are other Jewish people, but Jewishness doesn't play a role in how they define themselves. And so she knows she's, her, like my mother, her grandparents have all this beautiful art, and they live in this, they're involved in the art world of Paris. And she imagines herself in that way, as this child of privilege. And then the war happens, and the person based on her grandfather, happens in the book too. He kills himself, the president of the Antiquarian Society. His wife, who called Manu the Queen Bungler, is deported. She doesn't even make it to the camp. She dies in Drancy. And people are dispersing, and they're able to hide in plain sight. So she's coming to an awareness of her identity in the context of disguising the thing that is the core of her oppression.
Yeah.
She's in Catholic school. She's doing Holy Communion. She understands herself as Jewish, but she doesn't quite understand what that means. Right. But it has a huge impact. So I think their storytelling is a way for them to make sense of themselves to themselves, but you can be most vulnerable with this person that you suddenly fallen head over heels in love with, And so in the dark of his room, he tells her these stories that he knows that he doesn't quite grasp. He's gotten them from Zancy. He's heard them. And in relating them, he's creating them on the page or in her mind to a certain extent, but maybe for himself too, know?
Right. And it seems like that in the places where the storytelling creates tension between these two characters, the rapprochement comes from this understanding of the different ways in which they've both been oppressed, or they've both felt like, profoundly disempowered in their lives.
And both of them, as opposed to Mac, come from powerful families of privilege. Right. Obviously not ethnicity privilege in France, but wealth privilege, both of them. He's a descendant of the king, and he knows that.
Yeah, and so there's something they recognize in one another because of that sort of shared sense of lineage.
Yes.
Yeah. But then it's also interesting because there's a parallel in Mac's position in France at the time, because
Right.
the United States came in with this grand mission and this money for rebuilding war-torn Europe. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about, for those of among the audience who might not know as much about the Marshall Plan or about the sort of logistics of the role of the U.S. and France at that time. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, and then about how it became important to you to have this character, apart from the connection to your family, the obvious clear connection, how you knew that you needed that character to be a part of this romance of, between, Cecile and Seb at the time, like how we needed that third piece of the triangle.
Yeah. And historian friends, please forgive me for butchering the history. I'm going to vulgarize the history a little bit. But the way I'm reading it, the way I was reading it, particularly from Cecile's point of view, Europe is divided up amongst the Allied powers who win the war. But within France itself, there's this active debate about which way they're going to go. And there's a significant portion of the population that is geared towards communism, the Workers' Party, this and that, the Soviet Union. And Cecile falls in, like my mother did, that's where she allies with. That's where she sees the possibility of a future. To the people that my mother and Cecile in the book, her friends at that time, America to them represents Jim Crow and racism, right? They're not seeing America as this land of opportunity. It's sort of a symbol of sort of free market capitalisms and markets sort of dominating all that. So that part of the novel struck me as Mac represents that to a certain extent. But the piece of it that I thought was particularly interesting, not just because, again, coming from sort of my personal history, but Mac then has a privilege in that world of France, post-war France, that he doesn't have. That he explicitly does not have in the United States as a GI, as a black GI. There's a great book by Tyler Stovall, who died a couple of years ago, called Paris Noir. And I was reading it. It's all about black Americans in Paris. And I remember when I was reading it again, I'm probably working on what becomes the New Internationals, but I could we called our father Dottie. I could just see Dottie in so many of the scenes that he described, because here's this man who was super intelligent, but dropped out of school at a young age, right, because Jim Crow, is working with his mother, a very poor family. He's not the oldest child, but the oldest son, so he has a certain responsibility. And suddenly he finds himself in France, where he has prestige because of his race. He has American dollars as a GI. And Dottie was, he was very handsome, but he was very charming. And so that just he seemed the flip side of Seb, but also in a weird way, the flip side of Cecile. And I thought putting them together then, these people who, again, come from this place of vulnerability, but find or seeking something better, it just, to me, that a love triangle seemed, in real life, there was no real love triangle. My mom cheated on my father and me. But I thought putting them together in a more active way, where they're actually interacting, and that would allow me to dramatize the things you're talking about, that moment in that way.
Yeah. So I'm actually curious to know, when you were here at the Cullman Center, were you researching the history of the role of the U.S. in France at that time?
A lot.
Okay, so what were some of the exciting research points that you were pursuing while you were here?
I thought that the research I was going to be doing was going to be different, but I spent a lot of time in the. Did I say spended? I spent a lot of time in newspapers, because newspapers are so valuable, useful for me as a writer. But then I ended up stumbling upon these picture books. They weren't picture books in the child sort of way, but these books with a lot of pictures. There was one in particular. I think it's called Paris 1940 to 1944. So it was Paris during the occupation. And there's text, but it's mostly pictures. And so I have these characters in this world, and I have a sense of the political moment in all its aspects. But then I'm seeing what a bus looked like, what this particular building looked like. It wasn't just sort of all the monuments that you see in all the pictures of Paris.
Yeah.
It was, these neighborhoods that I knew from having lived there, but from this. So it was there was a richness there that allowed me to take what I thought I understood about Paris and Parisness and all that, and see it specifically, you know?
Right. It was a historically accurate depiction of daily life.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is exactly what you need to be able to render the daily life in the granularity that you use in this novel.
Cadun soap, these little details that you would just never know. I would never know.
Yeah. So it's interesting because in the course of his own exploration of his family's history, Seb discovers this amazing archive in Paris. And so I kept thinking of you sitting here in the Cullman Center doing research here and then writing your character who was doing research in Paris. Did you also do archival research in Paris when you were there?
I have in the past, and mostly with the newspapers.
Yeah, me too. It's really amazing to do it there because they bring out these huge folios and then they set it up on this big sloped block and you just turn these huge pages. Yeah.
Well, you totally read right through my process. Like, that's me in the archives. I was like, Seb's got to do something. Put him in the archives. But so.
But I love doing that research because it's like you saw all of the daily life in context. What was playing in the theaters at that time and, what kinds of shoes were being advertised and what were the other events that were going on that were concurrent with your historical events that you were particularly interested in.
That's how I stumbled on the riots. I hope I'm not giving too much away, but towards the end of the novel, there's unrest in the city between all these political pieces, and there are riots that take place. And that's how I wasn't aware of that particular riot. I stumbled on it in the archives like that, reading about it, seeing the pictures of it. In the book, the protesters they have these these placards. We want bread, and I, it was just that. The archives, you find these great incidences. It's not like my mom or any of my fathers lacked these events in their lives, but they needed to be honed and focused in a certain way, and that allowed that.
Yeah, that's right. And so then I think that the challenge becomes, given all the historical material that you uncovered, how do you then move the narrative? And I felt like one of the things that I absolutely loved about the book was that it always moved. It always, there's this profluence throughout the book that just makes you feel the kind of inexorability of time in the characters' lives. How do you do that? For the benefit of my NYU grad students who are here, how do you continue to advance the novel's clock?
That's a great question. And I learned it, I think I had a sense of it just from, again, what I like to read, but I really learned it with Black Cloud Rising. And Black Cloud Rising only takes place over, sort of the narrative present of the book over 3 weeks, but it was a really eventful 3 weeks. And so there, the history just gave it to me. But I understood in doing it and putting it there that was the thing that was, to me, it was important that readers keep turning, whether you were interested in the Civil War or this or that or whatever, if I could make the readers keep turning the pages, they would be sucked in. And they would maybe allow me to have these characters who have these sort of complicated stories that they can't make sense of,
Yes.
So I'm not good with spending time in a character's head thinking about the things they're thinking. I've tried to do it, but I just do it terribly. But I thought if I could marry it to action or pacing, that would keep the reader engaged. It was more challenging in this, again, because the novel spanned more time. But when I decided that it was going to take place in 1947, essentially over this kind of 6 or 7 month period, it became folding incident in, not just sort of structurally making it work, but folding it in so that it continued to build.
Yeah.
Right?
And it does.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm glad.
We have some questions from the audience that we would like to go ahead and ask now, if I can have them. Thank you. Here's a great one that I haven't asked yet. Can you discuss your choice of a title?
I was just, because I don't live in New York, I was just down in at Grove Atlantic, who published the book, and we were talking about that today, because it's just such a, I mean, it was just luck. I mean, hard work, but luck. The 500-page thing that circulated was called "What is Hidden Cannot Be Loved," which is lyrical, but it was a little bit too much. And then when I sort of got over my sort of feelings sorry for myself that it sucked, it was just Paris 1947. Straightforward, Paris 1947, good to go. But Morgan Entrekin at Grove was like, this totally works, but something else might work better. And I was reading like, Negritude poets. I was just looking for, Black Cloud Rising I pulled from a song. And I was like, are there songs? I was reading Edith Piaf lyrics, and I sent this really long email that had a gabillion suggestions, and none of them were great. But when I went back to photographs, and on the cover of the book, there's a black and white couple dancing. I found 4 or 5 pictures like that. One from the Taboo Club in Paris, and it was from 1947. It's not that picture, but it's like that. And I remember seeing that picture, and Morgan looked at that list, and he was always really drawn to the African colonists in Paris and that piece of it. And he was like, the New Internationals. And I was like,
great.
Thank you. I don't have to think about this ever again.
Yeah, that's a happy ending to that tale. Next question. Your mother, did she know you were writing a book about her life? If so, what did she think? If not, do you ever imagine her response?
Mom was completely a reader, just like both my sisters are, just like Noah is. Like readers, you just sort of devour books. I was not that guy. But I always valued literature, books at least. I'm not sure I knew what literature was. I could spell it probably, but I'm not sure I knew what it was. And so books were always there, and as I moved towards writing, Mom loved that. And Mom wasn't, I guess maybe you'll have to ask Miriam afterwards in the reception. Maybe she'd say something different. But I think she really liked that because she so valued books and authors. And she knew that I was telling her story, and I'm sure she had questions, but she gave me a lot of space. My African family, on the other hand, they're very private, and it was a little bit more difficult in that regard. But I feel like, and I'm not sure this may be the subtext that the question is asking, but I feel like it's kind of all fair game. I wanted to be respectful. I wanted to be respectful of them, and I was in conversation. It was never secretive, but I just felt like, y'all dropped me in this really complicated situation. There's a story to tell here, so I'm going to tell it. Yeah. But I'll say this, and it's probably, my anthropologist, psychoanalyst, would probably make a connection here. It's probably not coincidental that I started to figure the book out after they died. Mom died in 16, and Max died in 18, and it was at that point that the novel really started to take shape in a way that, so I'm sure there's something there.
And this question is a kind of good follow-up to the last. What are some of the ways in which the novel diverges farthest from your family's history?
That's a great question.
I love that I can sort of take credit for it just because I'm holding it. I don't know who asked it, but good job. You gave me a thrill.
I'm gonna not answer in a way that I hope answers it a little bit. But I've written some nonfiction too, personal nonfiction, like essay stuff, like a lot of writers have. And I remember reading an essay, I can't even remember by who it was, but he was talking about writing memoir and how or maybe it was Mary Carr, but when you begin to write memoir, you sort of give up your story in a certain way. It starts to transform. Right. And in a weird way, the flip side has happened, where this starts feeling like their history. And so where it's diverging, I don't always see clearly, because it feels like history. It feels like their history to me. Yeah. But in part because I've been living with it for 20 years.
Right. Right.
And imagining it. So where it diverges the most, I'm not sure I can answer it. I'm not sure. It feels like, so, yeah.
That's interesting. Excuse me. The interesting thing about that is just the story feels so real as you read it. It just feels like it's recreating this this powerfully verisimilitudinous experience where I was just fully invested in these characters' experience. As I've read in the course of researching my 2 novels that take place in France, I spent a lot of time in that period, and so the thing that kept coming back to me as I thought about how the story might dovetail with your experience was something that my grandmother said to me about the stories that I told in my first novel. Even though these things you described didn't all happen to our family, they all happened to someone we knew or people who were like our families. And they have that sense of representing true experience, whether they actually happen to your family or not.
I think my mom and Manu would respond that way. I think Solange and Max might not.
I see.
But I think my mom and Manu would respond that way. That even if you're not exactly getting it right, it feels right.
Well, it did to me, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question in a different vein. You said earlier that you reread more than you read. I do the exact same, and I'm curious as to why you do that. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, and this is sort of new to me. I've always known I'm not a great reader, but I didn't know that a reader, which I'm not a great reader until fairly recently. But I realized that I go back to books, even if I'm not reading the whole book, I go back to books and reread, I think in part because, again, sisters, a mother who are readers, and, again, I'm the guy, just if I could turn on the TV, I was good to go. And so when I decided I wanted to be a writer, or was going to try to, I very much rely on rewriting, and I think there's a correlation. Like when I'm living in Paris and I'm going to the American Library in Paris because books are cheaper and whatever, I didn't read Beloved till 87, but I remember I read it 5 times in a row, and I've read it 10 more times since, because it's a masterpiece and there's something I could never do it, but there's something to learn there. And so I think that's part of the impulse is I decided to be a writer and I have to figure this out. And rereading, like rewriting, it's just how I think I learned. It's really that. It's less although joy doesn't. I think about Beloved, and joy is not maybe the best way to describe it, but there's this beauty to it, and you feel the beauty, but at a certain point you also recall the sentences and the passages, and I'll get to a place that marked me, but as I'm getting to it, I'll remember, oh, this is how I'm getting there. And I think it's that. I think it's sort of like learning. This is completely, not completely digressive, but a little bit digressive. But as a case in point, I have friends, Beth Ann Fenley and Tom Franklin, who teach at the University of Mississippi, and that's where Faulkner's from. And I was thinking about writers of his generation's pre-MFA programs and all this, and how they're learning to be a writer. And something in Roanoke, I can't remember, I don't think it was that he wrote on the wall, but there was something where he was transcribing a book that clearly meant something to him. And I had been thinking about Morrison in the context of Faulkner, and I love Absalom, but I couldn't explain it to you. And so I thought, I'm going to do that. And I started that summer transcribing Absalom.
Oh, wow.
It was super instructive. So I'd read it at that point a few times, but to actually transcribe it was super instructive, so I got why he did it. But then, I stopped on page 43. I was like, I get it now. I don't need to transcribe another word of Faulkner.
But you learned something from it.
I learned
it's funny.
a lot.
We were talking about the exact same thing in class today, where we were studying the Tale of Genji, and talking about how one of the things that just barely predated the writing of the Tale of Genji was that a lot of Japanese court women were transcribing other tales, heroic tales. And in the process of transcribing those tales, women began to identify what was missing in them or what was not representing their own lived experience in those tales. And so I think it's an incredibly valuable practice to actually put those words down on the page. You can't fail to learn something from doing that.
As a case in point, there's a story that I love and that I teach a lot. It's from the mid-'80s by a Zimbabwean writer named Dembudzo Marashera, and it's a very short story. It's called Protista, but it's surreal, it's dense, it's difficult, but it spoke to me the first time I read it. And I teach it because I feel like the students completely get lost, and then I can sort of get them there. But for the first time 2 years ago in a graduate MFA workshop, I had them transcribe it because I was thinking about transcription. And for the first time ever, we got to class and everybody explained the story to me. It's a hard story, and they completely got it. For writers, it's a really great exercise.
Did they describe what was different for them?
I don't think they had the experience. This is their first introduction to the story. So for them, they just okay. But the whole time I was stopping and going, I can't believe you got that. It was just super. And maybe they were just a brilliant class, but I think it had something to do with that transcription exercise where they just accessed it in a certain way.
Amazing.
Yeah.
One thing that we didn't talk about yet, but I think we have a minute to talk about, and
Okay.
that seems important for us to address. I really love the way you explore gender roles in the book.
Thank you.
And I felt, as a woman reading the book, I felt like you paid a lot of attention, not just to received notions of gender, but to how gender manifested very specifically in that historical moment, especially in the ways that gender manifested differently between Cecile's generation and Elodie's generation. And I'm wondering how you thought about gender as you were writing the book, and how deliberate were those choices, and including an exploration of gender in this novel.
It's the Cullman and my Cullman class, that 500-page book. Cecile was as central, and she completely misses, and in part, I think, because I wasn't understanding her in that way. And when I did the presentation and we had the conversation, and folks were like, you can't cut her out. I think it was Maddie who made the suggestion, if you write her as nonfiction, maybe you'll figure out the problem with, that's maybe the problem.
I see.
And that led to the essay that came out a few summers ago. It was an exercise in trying to understand her. And I think in doing that, and then remembering Manu and going back to the letters, I think that's what opened that up. That was always I'm glad it works in that way for you. That was always my aim, but I failed really miserably. And so it was really doing that exercise of just going, okay, put Cecile to the side and write your mother as best you can, and then Cecile opened up.
Yeah, but it's difficult, because one of the things that's most central to your portrayal of her gender is her experience of her own sexuality, and there's it's hard, yeah. But there's a lightness there, there's a freedom there that I really appreciated in your writing, that actually reminded me a lot of The Golden Notebook.
Thank you.
And I had already been thinking about that novel because of its connections to communism, obviously, and the sort of disillusionment with communism that happened at that time, although in a different, geographic context. But there's a kind of non-fussiness in the way you write about her relationship with her sexuality. That just feels so much more honest somehow than this kind of like over focus on the ethics of sexuality that I think can sometimes be distracting in the portrayal of gender roles at that time.
Thank you. Yeah, it was very hard, but I'm glad it's working some. So.
It's just working great, and I'm so excited for everybody here to read it. And so we have copies for sale outside, and David's going to be signing for us, as Salvatore mentioned. And so I just wanted to thank you so much for going into detail and to depth and talking to us about the book.
Thank you.
And to thank all of you for those terrific questions, which I got to voice, which was really fun. And thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. It's just such a pleasure to be able to celebrate the book this way.
Thank you all. Yeah.